First, I want to say how thrilled I am that there's so many folks here. We have, as of the moment, 124 machines have connected, and as you can see, if you're looking through the gallery view, many of them have more than one person. So this is a great, great event. And I want to start by introducing the congregations and that are participating in this. So I want to welcome congregation Anshe Emeth, Rabbi Brian Milkow in Peoria, Illinois. Temple Anshe Chesed, Rabbi Rob Moray in Erie, Pennsylvania. Congregation Bethel, Rabbi Darrell Lerner, Bangor, Maine. Temple Bethel, Rabbi Erica Ash, Augusta, Maine. I guess Bethel is a popular name in Maine. Temple B'nai Abraham in Elyria, Ohio, Rabbi Lauren Werber. Temple Concord, Binghamton, New York, Rabbi Barbara Goldman Martell. Temple Israel, Columbus, Georgia, Rabbi Beth Schwartz. Moses Montefiore Congregation in Bloomington, Illinois, Rabbi Rebecca Dubo. Congregation Share Shalom, Hingham, Massachusetts, Rabbi Shira Joseph. And Temple Tikva, New Hyde Park, New York, Rabbi Randy Schein. So welcome to all of you, and of course to my own congregation, Temple Etz Chaim in Franklin, Massachusetts. I'm Tom Albert. Let me go over a couple of basic Zoom points. Please keep yourselves muted. We're going to try letting everybody control their own muting, but please keep yourselves muted. If you want to send messages to everyone or to one person, you can use the chat. Be aware, if you send it to everyone, everyone will see it. So if you really only mean to send it to one person, you should do that. And watch out for that one. We're going to be taking questions later in the chat, so please save them for after the presentation. And I would strongly suggest that you keep your screen in active speaker view as opposed to gallery view, so that you'll be able to focus on our speaker, which we'll get to presently. Let me introduce, you know what, let me highlight him first. Spotlight video, there we go. I'm gonna introduce our speaker, Jonathan Kaufman. Now, my respect for Jonathan, whom I've known for many, many years, has grown over time. I say it's grown because when we were in college, I did have to question his judgment. As the editor of the college paper, he allowed two people who had no apparent qualifications to write a weekly opinion column. That was my roommate and me. However, since that early miscue, he has gone on to doing some amazing things. He was a reporter for the Boston Globe, where he won his first Pulitzer Prize. Just keep that in mind for a second. His first Pulitzer Prize for coverage of racism and job discrimination in Boston. He was the senior editor and Beijing bureau chief of the Wall Street Journal. He was the executive editor at Bloomberg News, where he won several George Polk Awards and his second Pulitzer Prize. This one was for explanatory journalism dealing with tax dodging, which might or might not be relevant to anything that's happening now. I have no idea. And since 2015, he has been the director of the Northeastern University School of Journalism in Boston and a professor of journalism. He's written 3 books: Broken Alliance, The Turbulent Time Between Blacks and Jews, which was a National Book Award; A Hole in the Heart of the World, Being Jewish in Eastern Europe; and finally, the book that brings us here, The Last Kings of Shanghai, the rival Jewish dynasties that helped create modern China. And I am going to be placing the link to that in the chat when Jonathan starts to speak, and a few other places along the way. So if you don't have it, you may really want to get this book. You'll see why. The story of the rescue of the Shanghai Jews, which is part of Jonathan's book, is also told, part of it's told in a recent PBS documentary called Harbor from the Holocaust, in which Jonathan features. And on a personal note, I had the great pleasure and good fortune to serve as his rabbi for 3 years at another congregation and to officiate at the confirmation of his daughter and my daughter, which is one of the great pleasures. So without further ado, I introduce to you our speaker, Jonathan Kaufman.
Thanks very much, Tom. It's really an honor to be here. I often tell people I feel like publishing my book these days, it's like living under a Yiddish curse, which is may your book come out during a pandemic when all the bookstores are closed. So it's great to be able to connect with people. And obviously as authors, we launch our books into the world and love it that people are interested and want to buy it and want to talk about it. I'm also so glad that Tom reached out to me to set this up. As he suggests, we've known each other since before we knew our wives. And our paths crossed really unexpectedly in a congregation where he was a great rabbi. My kids still talk about him. So it's really been a lifelong friendship, and I'm really glad to be joining all of you tonight. And I want to thank Tom for organizing this. I'm going to talk for about half an hour, and then, as Tom says, we'll open it up to questions in the chat. Again, if at any point during my talk you're so moved that you want to go out and buy the book, I'll excuse that. You can ignore me for 5 minutes and buy the book, and I'll consider that time well spent. People often ask me, how did you come across this topic of Jews and China? I mean, it seems sort of improbable. In some ways, as journalists, we all operate by asking questions. Or by collecting anecdotes. And my interest in this topic really started way back in the late 1970s when I was a very young journalist right out of college and was one of the first American journalists able to visit China. And I went to Shanghai and I was walking along the Bund, which is that very famous stretch of the waterfront in Shanghai with those very distinctive Art Deco buildings. And I was looking for a bathroom. And so I was trying to figure out where to go. And I wandered into a hotel. And as I went through the door, I felt like I had gone from, communist China into a 1930s movie set. China back in the 1970s was still very communist. Mao had died just a few years before. Everybody out on the street was wearing those Mao suits. There were far more bicycles than cars. But when I passed through the doors of this hotel, I felt like I was on a movie set. There were marble floors, Lalique crystal chandeliers, a bellhop in a white uniform with a white cap came up to me and spoke to me in French. And so the incongruity of it just struck me that what was this place that seemed to have landed from another century doing in the middle of communist China? On a subsequent trip to Shanghai. And so when I asked about it, someone said to me, well, that hotel was built by Victor Sassoon, who was a Jewish playboy billionaire who had lived in Shanghai in the 1930s. So on a subsequent trip, the Chinese often assigned you, when you were a reporter, minders, people who kind of went with you to make sure you weren't asking, too provocative questions. And they always loved taking reporters to places where they would be reporting nice stories. And so on one of my subsequent visits, I was taken to the Children's Palace, it was called. So I went there and they said I'd be seeing, happy children,
okay,
ballet lessons, piano lessons. And so I went to this.
Not enough. I'll try to move it over.
Excuse me, please keep yourselves muted.
I can pull it over. So.
I went to this Children's Palace and it was like a huge.
That's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to get to Team Viewer. I can't get it.
Jonathan, why don't you wait a second? I'm going to mute everybody and then you can unmute yourself, okay?
I got it.
Okay,
go ahead. There you go.
Okay. I went inside and there were these, happy children taking their music lessons, but it was a massive mansion, 43 rooms. The ballroom was the size of a football field. And as I left, there was a little plaque at the entrance which said, this had once been the home of the Kadoorie family. And I knew the Kadoories because I was living in Hong Kong at the time. And the Kadoories were probably one of the most powerful and wealthiest families in Hong Kong. They were Jewish. And the idea that they had once lived in Shanghai in this incredible splendor was sort of shocking to me. And then in another trip I took to Shanghai, I was traveling in a part of the city known as Hangzhou. And I was walking through some old neighborhoods. And on the doorposts of many of the homes of the tenements that were there, I could see shadows of what had once been mezuzahs. You could still see the nail holes to the mezuzahs that had been posted on these doorposts. And again, I was trying to figure all this out. What were mezuzahs doing there? And of course, as Tom has mentioned, these were the relics left behind by the 18,000 Jewish refugees who had fled Nazism and made their way to Shanghai during World War II. So together, these all kind of made me think there was a history here, a story that I wanted to understand better. And as I plunged into it, I discovered it really started not in China, but in Baghdad. Baghdad was Babylon in the Bible. By the rivers of Babylon, we wept when we remembered Zion. We all remember that psalm. But what I discovered was that, I think as Jews, we know the story of Jewish history and, through Fiddler on the Roof, right? It's the story of Jews growing up in shtetls and poor neighborhoods and ghettos, gradually work their way up. That's true in the United States as well, to often great prominence and wealth, education, and so forth. But the story of these two families, the Sassoons and the Kaduris, was different. The Jews who went to Babylon, who were taken there by Nebuchadnezzar, may have wept by the waters of Babylon, but they were incredibly successful. They became very successful merchants, scholars. They were so prominent, in fact, that the rulers of Baghdad, whether they were Turkish or Ottomans or Persians, incorporated the Jews into society and relied on them for advice. They even appointed one family, the most prominent Jewish family, to be what was called the Nasi. And the Nasi was sort of the official advisor to the king, sort of the secretary of the treasury, who would advise him on financial matters. And when the Nasi visited the Pasha, he would be carried on a sedan chair through the streets of Baghdad. And everyone in Baghdad, Jews and non-Jews alike, would bow their heads in reverence as a sign of respect. So the Sassoon family was this prominent family. They were immensely wealthy, immensely influential. They had trading networks all across the Middle East. And as often happens in Jewish history, politics turned against them. And members of the Sassoon family were being kidnapped and held for ransom by the government. So David Sassoon, who became the patriarch of the family, was in his 30s. He was being groomed to take over this family dynasty. And he was imprisoned by the Pasha and held for ransom. And his father concluded that this was only the start, that the family was now imperiled. So he ransomed his son out of prison, hustled him down to a dock in the waterfront in Baghdad, put him on a boat, and set him out of the country to safety. And before he left, he put a cloak around him. And in that cloak, he sewed pearls so he could get a start, a financial start, wherever he landed. So I think of this story not as a Fiddler on the Roof story, but almost a Shakespearean story of a prince who was supposed to take over this vast business empire, who has his birthright taken away from him, and basically spends the rest of his life, and his family spends the rest of their lives trying to recapture what was taken from them when they had to flee Baghdad. David Sassoon spent his first night out of Baghdad in a warehouse near India, where he was sleeping with a gun, shooting rats as they skittered aside. But he was a very smart man. And he looked around, and he had arrived in India just as the British were arriving in India. And he realized that there were great opportunities for people with business background. And within a matter of a few short years, David Sassoon became one of the wealthiest merchants in India. He also became a British citizen and very closely allied to the British colonial government. Again, when we talk about Jews and when we teach Jewish history in our Sunday schools, we often talk about Jews as liberals, Jews as socialists, Jews as fighting for the underdog. The Sassoons basically decided to ally themselves with British imperialists, with the colonists, and with the expansion of Britain all across Asia. And as a businessman, David Sassoon looked around and saw that opium was a very profitable business. Now, opium was was legal at the time. And in fact, the British had fought a war against China and had invaded China for the right to sell opium, for British firms to sell opium in China. And so once China was opened up to trade, David Sassoon began to trade in opium. And then he had 8 sons. And he decided to deploy these 8 sons across China to kind of build up his business. But what really distinguished the Sassoons was that they were incredibly innovative. I think of them as the Silicon Valley entrepreneurs of their time. For example, most companies who were shipping opium to China relied on sailing ships. They would load the opium in India, they would sail to China where they would sell it. But the Sassoons figured out that if you bought steamships, which were a very new innovation at the time, you could get to China a lot faster and beat your competitors. They used the telegraph so that these various brothers scattered across China could communicate with each other about the price of opium, the price of products. They were a very innovative and powerful family. They also learned that these 8 sons could develop political and social clout. David Sassoon made sure that all of his sons learned English. He also made sure that all of their wives learned English too, which was quite progressive for the time, because he expected to be able to send them to London, where they would buy country houses, they would hobnob with the British aristocracy. They ended up sending their children to Eton and to Cambridge, and through that became very influential. They even would go on weight loss trips with the future King of England. So the Sassoons became both a very powerful political and business dynasty throughout China. One of the seductions of the British Empire was that it allowed outsiders like the Sassoons, who were Jewish, to become part of the aristocracy. They were all knighted. But it was also seductive. And what began to happen to the Sassoons was that all these sons who had been sent overseas kind of liked the good life in London, and they weren't paying attention to the business. And one of the interesting things that happens is that the talent pool starts to run thin. And so the Sassoons are living it up in London, but meanwhile in India and in China, things are not going so well. And that's where Victor Sassoon, who is, I think, in a way, one of the most remarkable figures, enters the story. Victor Sassoon was a playboy, a handsome guy, had gone to Cambridge and was always seen with a chorus girl on either arm. And his family basically thought he was just going to be one of these, playboy millionaires who never took business seriously and spent a lot of their money. But during World War I, he was in an airplane accident and was injured. He became crippled. And he basically felt that he had no future anymore in London society, that because he needed 2 canes to get around all the time, no woman would go out with him, and that his social standing would plummet. So he decides to go to China to take over the business. And he turns out to be a remarkably smart and astute businessman. He basically moves all the family money and all the family businesses to Shanghai, which at the time is still something of a backwater. Marco Polo hadn't even bothered to visit it when he had visited China back in the 1300s. But Victor Sassoon decides he's sort of captured by the glamour, the potential glamour of Shanghai. And he turns Shanghai really into one of the most exotic and exciting cities in the world. He builds the Cafe Hotel, which is the hotel that I ended up stumbling into when I was looking for a bathroom, and makes it the fanciest hotel in all of Asia. He brings in chefs from Europe. He brings in managers from the best hotels in London. he holds these extraordinary parties there where they're costume balls, and he'll dress up as a ringmaster and make all the guests dress up as circus acts. He'll dress up as a schoolmaster and make everyone dress up as children. Europeans start flocking to Shanghai to sort of see this kind of incredibly exotic and slightly naughty city. Charlie Chaplin goes to visit Victor Sassoon. Noel Coward writes private lives in his hotel. Wallis Simpson, who will end up seducing the King of England and making him leave his throne, has dirty pictures taken in Shanghai of her dressed only in a life jacket. So that gives you kind of a sense of what Shanghai was like. In fact, when I visited Shanghai, when I was doing the research and visited the hotel, I got to visit Victor Sassoon's old suite, which had been preserved and restored. And I went into the bathroom, which was very lavish, and it had 2 bathtubs. And I turned to the Chinese guy taking me around, and I said, "Why are there 2 bathrooms?" And he said, "Well, Sir Victor always said that he didn't mind sharing his bed, but he didn't like sharing his bath." So that gives you a sense of kind of what Shanghai was like. And in fact, when I was doing the research and I was going through Victor Sassoon's diaries, he had these diaries where he kept records of all his business meetings and social engagements. And I'm in this library, very proper library, and I'm turning the pages carefully, and these photographs start slipping out of naked women. And I was kind of a little terrified that the librarians would come over and kick me out. And it turned out Victor Sassoon was an amateur photographer. And one way he would meet women was by going up and saying, "Would you like to come to my studio? And I'll take your picture." And so that gives you a sense of kind of what Shanghai was like. And I think this is important because I think that, we think of China as being, a place where there was once a great Chinese empire. The West came in and sort of carved it up. The communists came and now have launched China on its great success. But the fact was, in the 1920s and 1930s, largely due to Victor Sassoon and also the Kaduris, who I'll talk about some more, really was an incredibly cosmopolitan global city. It was one of the largest cities in the world. It had a better infrastructure than London. And it was a place where Chinese were beginning to learn about the world. And so they would go to Victor Sassoon's hotel and go to these dances and have their picture taken with Victor and record phonograph records of toasts and so forth. It was really a way in which the world began to open to China and China began to open to the world. Now, Victor was a wonderful playboy. It's a wonderful story. But starting in the late 1930s, these cruise ships that were arriving started bringing other people to Shanghai. And at this point, these were refugees, Jewish refugees, who were fleeing Vienna and Berlin. As we all know, as the Nazis rose and Jews were trying to flee Germany and Austria especially, most countries, including the US, shut their door. They would not let these refugees in. But Shanghai was unique because the British controlled part of it, the Americans controlled part, the French controlled part, no one really controlled the immigration to Shanghai. So if you got to Shanghai, you could walk on the shore without a visa. And so word of this began to spread among the refugee of middle class, mostly Jews in Vienna and Berlin, who by the 38, 39 were desperate to leave. Nobody else would let them in, but they caught word that this place called Shanghai, if you got there, you were safe. And so many middle-class Jews from Vienna and Berlin sold their belongings and were buying tickets to these ships that would then take them to Shanghai. Now imagine what that was like. You're leaving Vienna, you're leaving Berlin, you're a middle-class family, doctors, lawyers, merchants, store owners. And after this long journey, you're stepping into Shanghai, where no one spoke your language, you didn't speak any Chinese. Most of the refugees showed up in their very proper German or Austrian clothes. They had no money. And in the middle of this crisis, Ellie Kadoorie, who's the other family that I write about, meets with Victor Sassoon. Now, the Kadoories were not as well off as the Sassoons. They were in some ways the poor relations. They had also grown up in Baghdad, but they had had some family tragedies. And their mother had tried to figure out a way that she could hold the family together and get some money to survive. And so the Sassoons at that point were trying to expand their empire in the late 1800s, and they decided to staff it with other young Jews from Baghdad. So this was an opportunity for, if you were a family that had maybe had aspirations for your sons, and they were always sons, you could send them to work for the Sassoons. And what the Sassoons said was, if you send us your teenage boys, we'll educate them, we'll guarantee them a job. We're going to build a Jewish hospital, so if they get sick, they'll have care. We'll build synagogues where they can worship. If they die, we'll build a Jewish cemetery. And so Ellie Kadoorie, who becomes the patriarch of the Kadoorie dynasty, is 15 years old when he leaves Baghdad. He makes his way to Bombay, starts to work for the Sassoon, makes his way to Hong Kong, and finally to China when he's 18 years old. And again, imagine what it must be like to be, 15, 16, 18 years old. You've left your family behind. You're suddenly in the middle of China where you don't speak the language, where conditions are very primitive. And so he begins to work for the Sassoons, but like a lot of ambitious young men, looks around and decides, there's a lot of money being made here, so I can make some of it too. So he leaves the Sassoons and begins to set up his own businesses. There was a lot of anti-Semitism among the British. And in a way, one of the advantages for the Kadoories for that, they were sort of shut out of the traditional British businesses and companies. So Ellie Kadoorie had to scramble. He was a hustler. And so he began to cut business deals with Chinese, with other immigrant groups. And he brings electricity to Hong Kong, the first time that electricity comes to Hong Kong. He begins to build hotels. He begins to collect investments. And so by the 1930s, he is also in Shanghai and is one of the most prominent people in Shanghai, much less one of the most prominent Jewish financiers. And as these Jewish refugees arrive, Ellie Kadoorie makes his way to Victor's office with the 2 bathtubs. And he says to him, Victor, look, I know you're a playboy. I know you like the good life. And the truth is, Victor was not very religious. I often say that he was far more likely to give a donation to a synagogue than to set foot in one. But Ellie says to him, Victor, this is a crisis for our people, and you need to step up. You need to help these refugees. You need to help save them. And to his great credit, Victor Sassoon does. He begins to convert. He owns a tremendous amount of property in Shanghai, and he converts a lot of his office buildings into canteens and dorms and soup kitchens for these Jewish refugees that are pouring off the boats. He owns a lot of property in this Hangzhou neighborhood, and he turns that over to the refugees. He begins to employ them. He begins to give them money. The Kadoories start a school, and they hire some of these refugees to teach in the school because they're very upset that the children of these refugees have no place to go. They're roaming the streets of Shanghai. One of the most remarkable things Victor Sassoon does, though, he basically sets as his mission to convince the Japanese who are closing in on Shanghai as World War II approaches, not to harm these Jewish refugees. Now, the Japanese had begun invading China in the early 1930s. And by 1937-38, they basically encircled Shanghai and they had occupied part of the city. And the Japanese were very anti-Semitic. They believed that Jews controlled the world economy, that they controlled world power. But they also believed that if you were on the good side of the Jews, they could help you. And they, in their warped sense, had identified Victor Sassoon as one of the most powerful Jews in the world and believed that if they could persuade him to work on their behalf, then that might further Japanese interests. So the Japanese appointed a captain who was an anti-Semite to be in charge of the Jewish problem in Shanghai. And he began to meet with Victor Sassoon. And Victor Sassoon was an incredibly charming guy and basically embarks on what I consider one of the great con jobs of World War II. He begins to meet with this anti-Semitic Japanese captain. And he says to him, oh, of course, you know, I go shooting and hunting with Churchill in England. I'll mention to him that England shouldn't get involved in the war against Japan. I'll talk to my friends in the US who control the press and know Roosevelt, and I'll make sure the US stays out of the war. At the same time, he's basically secretly giving money to these refugees. He flies to South America to try to buy land where he thinks these Jews might be able to resettle. And as a result, the Japanese allow the Jews to keep on arriving. And ultimately, 18,000 Jewish refugees arrive in Shanghai, and the Japanese continue to allow it. Ultimately, the Japanese catch on to what Victor's doing, and he has to flee the country. He flees to India. The Kaduris are not so lucky. They don't leave in time, and they're imprisoned by the Japanese, put in a Japanese army camp. And Eli Kaduri, the patriarch, ends up dying in his mansion, that great mansion that I saw when I was in Shanghai. He ends up dying in the servants' quarters of that mansion under house arrest. But the miracle of Shanghai is that at a time when the Holocaust was going on, when the Japanese were allied with the Nazis, not a single Jew was killed in Shanghai of these 18,000 refugees, which is truly remarkable. And one of the legacies of that is that many Jews, including Lawrence Tribe, who's a professor at Harvard, Peter Max, who did those famous posters in the 60s, these are all children of these Jewish refugees and part of their legacy. So the war ends, and the Kaduris and the Sassoons, who by that time were nearly billionaires, turn out to be very shrewd businessmen, but not very good politicians. Both families return to Shanghai after the war, convinced that things will return as normal, the parties will resume, they'll keep making money. And of course, the communists advance, they control Shanghai, and both families have to flee. The Sassoons leave China. Victor Sassoon leaves China, and he never goes back. He buys a return ticket, but he never returns to Shanghai. And he becomes very, very bitter about it. The Kaduris end up being smarter. They go to Hong Kong. And what's interesting is there were two brothers, Lawrence and Horace. And their father had been, quite a strong hand in the family. He had made his boys work for the company, work for him, and they were very much in his shadow. And with the war over, their father had died in captivity. And suddenly Horace and Lawrence were the inheritors of this business living in Hong Kong. And they concluded that their father had made a mistake, that he had isolated himself in a bubble, that he had been blind to all the problems that had led to the rise of communism, and that they were going to do things differently. And so over the next 40 years, the Kaduris rebuild their fortune, and more so in Hong Kong. Today, they're the richest Western family in China. They're worth more than $13 billion. But they also devote themselves to an enormous amount of charity designed to help Chinese refugees who are fleeing communism and coming into Hong Kong. So, starting in the 1950s, these farmers are coming over. They have no money, they have no skills. And the Kaduris basically begin funding the purchase of little plots of land where these farmers can start growing crops and sell them. They fund a lot of research into animal husbandry, including pigs. Obviously, pork is a staple of the Chinese diet. And so they fund a lot of research that will allow these Chinese refugees to raise pigs that have more meat that they can then sell. They ended up helping more than 300,000 of these refugees. And in fact, among the Chinese, this joke develops where they say the Kaduris know everything about a pig except what it tastes like, because they're keeping kosher and they eat it. So the Kaduris, end up, playing an enormous role in Hong Kong. Today, obviously, they're very nervous. They don't know what the future holds. The last thing I want to mention is the role of women, because I think the role of women in these families is fascinating. And I'll just tell you kind of two quick stories. One is the Kaduri family. So Eli Kaduri, as I said, was very much a hustler, a man on the make. And by the time he's in his 30s, he's made his first millions. He's very wealthy, and he decides it's time to go find a wife. So as somebody would do in that age, he sails to London, and he meets members of the British, really Jewish aristocracy, very prominent, wealthy Jewish families in London. And he meets a woman, Flora Sassoon, whose father is very prominent in Jewish society and in the Jewish world. They fall in love, they decide to get married. And typically what would happen would that Laura would likely get pregnant, Ellie would go back to Shanghai, resume his business, and then kind of visit London periodically to drop in on the children who would be raised as British in London. But Flora Kaduri is very different. She's actually older than Ellie. She's in her mid-30s when she gets married, which is really considered a spinster at that point. This is right around 1900. And she tells Ellie, I'm coming with you. I'm coming with you to China. You're not going to leave me here. So they arrive in Hong Kong together. And Laura has two children, one right after another. And one of the great gifts I discovered when I was doing the research is that Flora Kaduri kept a diary from 1900 to about 1919 about her life in China. And it's just extraordinary because you see her spirit. She had these two babies, and admittedly she had a governess and all that, but she basically travels across China with her husband. They see, gunships with the Japanese fighting the Russians. They go through the kind of terrible poverty in Shanghai and Beijing. She just sees China at a ground level. And I think in many ways, it's sort of like reading about Katharine Hepburn and the African Queen. I mean, she has this great spirit about her, but I think she also in a way becomes the conscience of the family. And one of the things she does, and again, this is in 1905, 1910, she decides to start a number of charities to build schools for Chinese girls in China, which at the time was unheard of. The idea that a rich British woman would start schools for Chinese girls was really unheard of. And it really came from Laura's belief that if girls got an education, that could help China and it could help them. She had always complained to her husband, Ellie, that they were traveling so much and so much for his business. She wanted a place of her own. And so they moved into a mansion in Shanghai, not the one that I visited, but an earlier one. And she's raising her boys there. And then there was a house fire in the mansion. And everybody runs out. But Laura is outside and she thinks that the governess, the Chinese governess, was still inside. So she runs back inside to save the governess. It turned out the governess had gone out another way. And Laura got blinded by the smoke and lost, and she dies in the house fire. The Chinese still talk about this because the idea that a British woman would run into a mansion and try to save the life of her Chinese servant just astounds them. And I think has a profound impact on the family in that it does kind of make them more aware and give them a greater sense of what tragedy is like, and I think helps explain a lot of their philanthropic efforts. In the Sassoon family, there's an interesting situation where, as I mentioned, a lot of the boys, men who were being put in charge of the dynasty in the late 1800s, were going to London and living the high life. And as a result, the final brother who's left behind dies prematurely. He dies of a heart attack. And his wife is basically left in India, and her son isn't yet of age to take over the Sassoon business. So she says to all the other brothers who were in London, look, I'll take over the business. I'll run things as a caretaker for a few years till my son can take over. The brothers think that's fine. She's a woman after all. What's she going to do? She will be a caretaker. They figure that, they can hold things in control for a few years. But Flora Sassoon turns out to be an extraordinary woman. She speaks several languages. Her grandfather, David Sassoon, had actually trained her in many languages. And this is at a time now when not only women couldn't vote in India, they couldn't even appear in public. And so Flora Sassoon begins to run this business empire from her living room, writing letters, getting information, and she's incredibly successful. And in fact, she does start breaking through a lot of this discrimination, visits factories across India, communicates to the Sassoon businesses in Shanghai. And even in kind of an echo of what's going on today, when a pandemic breaks out, the bubonic plague breaks out, becomes a real problem in Bombay, and her factories close, her workers are afraid to go to work. Flora Sassoon funds research that is going to find a cure for the bubonic plague, a vaccine, and she publicly goes out and gets the vaccine shot and has a photograph taken of her, which is kind of astounding to many of her Indian workers. But again, they think this high-born British woman is prepared to, take this vaccine, it must be safe. So the Sassoon brothers are watching all this, and they decide basically that Flora is a threat to them. And so they essentially kick her out of the company in a boardroom coup. They get together, they go through various financial machinations, and they throw her out of the company. And she does live a very distinguished life. She moves to London, she becomes a great hostess and scholar, but she never sets foot in the business again. And so I think this is an example that, I often say there are these women who kind of hit the bamboo ceiling, but there is a way in which the story of these women is a reminder of the role that women played in these families, which often history doesn't acknowledge, but I think is an important one to know about. But I'll stop there, and then Tom, if you want to throw me any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Wow. You can, for those of you who haven't read the book, you can see why you should. There's still a huge amount left in it, but that was wonderful, amazing. Let me say to people, I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and while I'm doing that, if you have questions, please put them in the chat, and we'll get to as many as we can. So, one other thing I want to tell everyone is that there is a recording of this that's being made, and in a couple of days, you'll get a link to it. And so you can also pass that on to people that were going to be on this call and wanted to be on the call and couldn't do it because they were unavailable. The timing didn't work for them. Okay, so Jonathan, first question. You've written 3 books. They all have something to do with Jews. And yet, the Jews have not been sort of the focus in some ways of much of your journalistic career. So how does it happen that you ended up writing 3 books all about Jews?
Well, Tom, as you may remember, when my kids were in Sunday school, when you were our rabbi at Sunday school, they'd learn the song, wherever you go, there's always someone Jewish. But I mean, I think what ties them together, I've written about, the history of Blacks and Jews in the US, about Jews in Europe under communism, and now this book. And I think in the way, all 3 books speak very much, I think, to most people in this audience and to American Jews today, which is these were Jews who were living in the world, right? Their Jewish identity was important to them. Some were religious more so than others, but certainly their ethical grounding and their history, they took great pride in it, but they were Jews of the world. And so I guess in a way, what's interesting to me about this book and ties into your question is that these families would have been worth writing about even if they weren't Jewish. And I think in some ways the business aspect of it and their incredible success is interesting from that point of view. But one of the things, when I first, when you write a book like this, before you write it, you meet with publishers and they end up offering you money and they want to bid against each other. And they would always ask me the question, what's this book about? And they would say, is this a Jewish story? Is it a China story? And I kept on saying, no, it's a family story. And it's a story of these two families. And in a way, I think that's one way in which the Jewish part of it really comes through. Not to say that Christians or WASPs or other groups don't have their own family mishigas, but it was interesting in these families to see the way their values, I think, really shaped a lot of the decisions they made. I mean, one of the, it was really interesting, the Kaduris, these two brothers, who in some ways were rivals. One was in Shanghai, one was in Hong Kong in the 20s and 30s. And the one in Hong Kong was the elder brother and was always lording it over his younger brother, saying, you need to work harder and all this kind of stuff. But in their letters back and forth, they always wrote, with great affection, give my love to your family. There was kind of a humanity that came through that. And I think in the same way, Victor Sassoon's switch from kind of millionaire playboy to kind of moral man during the refugee crisis is another example of, how do we all ask ourselves, how will we act in a crisis? What will we do when there's a moment where we have to choose? And I think from a Jewish point of view, I found it very reassuring that they were mentions, right? And that, even while they were imperialists and they dealt in the opium trade and all that's true, in some ways they reminded me a little bit of kind of, Michael Bloomberg or a lot of the, Jewish titans that we read about, the Rothschilds and others. They were conservative, they were wealthy, but they still, for their time, were probably more liberal than most. And again, I think there's something interesting about Jewish history that even when we as Jews enter the world and do things and are part of the broader society, we do seem to carry some DNA that has us do the right thing. Maybe not all the time, but more often than not. And that was something that I think kind of connected me, my reporting life, but also my secular life with those religious roots.
Great, thank you. Let me get some of the questions in the chat. A couple have to do with individual connections. One is were the Sassoons you spoke of related to Ramos Sassoon of Kobe? And another one is Vidal Sassoon related? I know the answer to the second one since I read the book, but you tell us.
Right. So unfortunately not. I think I probably would be selling more books if I could say that Vidal Sassoon was related. The Sassoons were a huge and sprawling family, so I don't know the specifics of the family you're asking about, but there are Sassoons all over. And the family itself is actually, it's quite interesting. My book's about to come out in England in about 2 weeks. And there the Sassoons are well known as kind of a political family, but also Siegfried Sassoon, the great poet from World War I, was a member of the Sassoon family. And the Sassoons were very prominent in British politics, but no, there were no hairdressers among them.
Let me get back. There's some other questions, but let me just jump ahead to another Sassoon one, which was, did the Sassoons regret building their fortune on a...
I'm sorry, could you speak up? Could you speak up, Tom? I'm losing you.
Sorry. There are various questions. Let me jump to another Sassoon-related one specifically here. Did the Sassoons regret building their fortune on a foundation of opium?
No, that's a great question. No and yes. So when you talk to the Sassoons today, they basically argue much the way I think the Kennedys would argue about building their fortune on liquor, or cigarette companies would argue about building a fortune on cigarettes. They basically say, look, opium was legal at the time, and that is true. It was legal in India, it was taxed. In fact, the Sassoons would sell shares in opium to the Prince of Wales as this sort of for financial gain. And people would take opium in Europe before aspirin was invented. And so they say, look, this was a vice, and we, we're businessmen, and we kind of, did what we had to do as businessmen. I don't think that's true. And when I went through the archives, a couple of things become clear. One is the Sassoons knew how dangerous opium was. I mean, to put it in some kind of context, probably about 12% of Chinese citizens were addicted to opium by the early 1900s. Now, in America, about 2% of Americans are addicted to hard drugs, opioids, and so forth. And we see both the pain the opioid crisis is causing and the upheaval and the anger. So now imagine 6 times that. So the Chinese government was opposed to the sale of opium, but the British had won the war, and so they had to approve it. And the Sassoons themselves often had to fire Chinese employees because they were getting addicted to opium. There were all these cases where they just, people couldn't work anymore. They had to dismiss them. The Sassoons themselves never took opium. And there was also a very large political movement against opium starting in the 1870s, 1880s. There were societies calling for its repeal. Over and over again in Parliament, there were demands to have it repealed. In San Francisco, they were banning opium dens for Chinese immigrants coming over. So the Sassoons knew what they were doing. And in fact, because they were so influential in England politically, they used all their power to delay efforts to make the opium trade illegal. And it wasn't until 1912, 1913 that they were able to do it. So, I think that we have to have there's a moral accounting for that. And I think it was Balzac said, every fortune is built on a crime. And in this case, the crime was opium. The Chinese, when the communists conquered Shanghai, they seized all the Sassoon business records. And I got a chance to look at them. And the Chinese calculated that the Sassoons probably made about $1 billion in opium. It was money they originally made in opium and then invested in real estate and so forth. But and that came at an enormous cost to Chinese society. And I think that's something I don't flinch from in the book. And I think is something we have to recognize.
So several people have some connection or the other to the Shanghai community in this story. Let me just find, there was one in particular.
I'm sorry, Tom, I'm losing you again.
I'm saying that several people have some kind of a connection, who are asking questions, have some kind of a connection to the Shanghai community in one form or another. Let me ask you a particular, I'll just pick one here. This is from David Mansky, who says, I have an uncle of my father from Poland who was in the Jewish ghetto in Shanghai during World War II. He died there. Is there a Jewish cemetery that may still exist in Shanghai where I could find his gravesite?
Yeah, so during the Cultural Revolution, which clearly wreaked enormous havoc in China, all the Jewish cemeteries, all the cemeteries were destroyed in Shanghai, except for one. And what's interesting is the Kaduris, as I mentioned, their father, Eli, died in Japanese captivity, and their mother, Laura, had died in a house fire. And so the Kaduris always assumed that that when the cemeteries were destroyed during the Cultural Revolution, they would never, that there would be no possibility of seeing their families' graves. When Lawrence Kaduri finally made it back to Shanghai, the Chinese invited him back in the 1980s. They told him to go to a special foreigners cemetery, and there he found the gravestones of his parents. Now, a lot of us believe that they weren't the real gravestones, that they probably were reproductions, which the Chinese are very good at. But that was a sign that in China, there had been some reverence for the Kaduri family, and so they had preserved this. In terms of people who have connections to Shanghai, I think probably the best thing to do is to get in touch with the Jewish Refugee Museum, which is in Shanghai. It's on the web. And they have very good records of the Jews who were in the ghetto, Jews who lived there. That's probably where I would start. Also, if you Google Jewish refugees Shanghai, there are a number of kind of alumni associations that have been built, that have been created around the world in the US and elsewhere that do kind of trace people and see where see where they're going. So again, that's another area where you might be able to track that kind of thing down.
Okay. So people tell me that like you, Jonathan, my microphone seems to be down and I can't figure out why.
It's getting better. It's getting better.
Good. Maybe if I just keep shouting, it'll help. The next questions were, there's one having to do with, we're going to ask for your expertise now as a China watcher. So now where is the Kadoorie family going to go to now? What's going to happen with Hong Kong?
It's a great question. I think for the Kadoories, it has to be a little bit of, oh my God, are we going through this again? So the Kadoories had fled Shanghai. They became richer than ever in Hong Kong, and most of their fortune is in electricity. They own the biggest power company. They own hotels in Hong Kong, the peninsula chain. Now, one thing the Kadoories decided after Shanghai fell and they lost almost everything was that they would never get caught a second time. So when when the Jewish refugees are leaving Shanghai, a lot of them are going through Hong Kong to go on to Palestine, Australia, the United States. And so the Kadoories basically go up to a lot of these families and give them literally brown paper packets of money and say, when you land in Australia, when you land in the United States, will you start buying up property for us and register it in our name so we can start building investments outside of China? So about half their money now is outside of Hong Kong. Within China, the Kadoories were very successful after the communists took over mainland China, never to say a bad word about the communists. They had their private views, but they always believed that one day China would kind of emerge from its red China phase and need contact with the West. And in fact, when China opens up in 1978, 79, one of the first phone calls Beijing makes is to the Kadoories, asking them to invest. And the Kadoories have huge investments in the mainland. But they're obviously very nervous. And it's interesting, but it gives you a sense of the savviness of the family. As I was getting ready to publish the book, the demonstrations were going on in Hong Kong and all the kind of pro-democracy protests. And so I wrote to Michael Kadoorie, who's now the patriarch of the family. And I said, I'd like to talk to you just for like an epilogue about, does this feel like Shanghai and what's it like? And Michael writes back to me and he said, well, in a very British way, he said, well, I'm traveling a lot these days, so I'm not as up on current events in Hong Kong as I would like to be. He knows exactly what's going on in Hong Kong and probably knew more than most, but I think he recognized that there was nothing he wanted to say publicly at that point because he's involved in this dance with the Chinese government. And I think it's important because, you know, it's not just his family's fortune. I mean, these are issues that Google and Microsoft and Zoom are all facing. How do you deal with China, which is, you know, cracking down on dissidents, you know, increasing surveillance? You know, these are dilemmas that every company is facing. And I think the Kadoories are facing it too. Michael Kadoorie has great affection for Shanghai and China. He's sort of a romantic about it. He remembers Marble Hall. He remembers bicycling his tricycle along the veranda in front of the family mansion. I think other relatives in the family are probably thinking we need an exit strategy. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Okay, well, that gets me to another of my personal questions, which is, in the research for this book, especially particularly in your interviews that you did during this, what was the thing that most stood out to you or most surprised you? What did you?
Yeah, I think there were a couple of things. One of them, you know, which is kind of amazing, even as I think about it, in both families, who basically, you know, stood astride Chinese politics and business for more than 175 years, sprawling families, 8 sons, not a single one of them ever bothered to learn Chinese. And that may tell you all you need to know about British imperialism and colonialism. They had people for that, right? They had staff, they had, you know, Chinese who worked for them. But again, I think it created this bubble in which they lived, which meant that they couldn't they couldn't sort of see what was happening. And so that was something I looked back and found quite surprising. And then the other thing I think that I found interesting was what it said about families. You know, I don't want to lecture anybody about decisions they've made about child rearing or the decisions we've all made with our kids, but it is interesting to me that both patriarchs had a very strong hand with their children. David Sassoon had these 8 sons, and he sent them around the world, and they reported to him. After he died, the family split up. The brothers started fighting. They split into 2 rival businesses. And it was a way in which the resentments that had been built up when their father was alive suddenly came to the fore. Eli Kaduri, after his wife died, went and literally yanked his 2 boys, who were late teenagers, early 20s by then, out of school in London. He basically said to them, you know, one was studying to be a lawyer, one was studying to be an architect, and he said, we're stopping that, you're coming back to Shanghai, you're working for me. And he basically made them kind of be his aides for the rest of his life. And so it kind of makes you think, and in no other context do I say this, but you know, you look at Trump, for example, and kind of see the control he has over his family. And so I found myself thinking, if you're trying to build a dynasty, you sometimes have to do things that maybe are against your parental instincts. But in the end, you know, you preserve great wealth and you have great success, but there are also these unintended consequences. And again, I think in both families, the women, the mothers, soften things. They certainly, you know, both morally are the conscience. I think they do most of the child rearing, but they're limited in sort of the influence they have. So it's just a kind of interesting, it has certain resonance, I think, personally, I found in sort of the decisions we make about how far to let our children roam and what's going to happen. Because again, imagine, I mean, I think of David Sassoon, right? I mean, a lot of us have trouble with our kids moving one time zone away. David Sassoon had 8 sons and sent them to countries where, you know, he didn't see them for like years at a time and only communicated with them by letter. You know, it's a certain force of will you need as a parent to kind of build a dynasty.
Yeah. Someone asks, why is the main street called the Bund, which sounds to our Jewish ears very German or Yiddish?
Yeah, it's actually Indian. Because these families originally came from India. They passed through Bombay on their way to Shanghai. And Bund is like a Hindi word that means the kind of embankment along a river. So yeah, it's Hindu, not Yiddish or Jewish. And frankly, one of the things I do want to point out, you know, when these Jewish refugees were coming from Berlin and from Vienna, and this is in a way is kind of similar, I think, to a lot of the American experience about the German Jews and the Russian Jews and the Polish Jews. Victor Sassoon, even as he was, you know, helping them, really didn't like them, was sort of embarrassed by them. Because remember, Victor Sassoon was hobnobbing with British aristocracy. He was meeting with Chiang Kai-shek. He was having these elaborate dinner parties. And he was a little embarrassed by these Jewish refugees who didn't have any money. In fact, one of Victor's affairs is with Emily Hahn, who was a writer for The New Yorker, a fascinating woman, worth a book in herself. And she and Victor were having an affair. At the same time, she was having an affair with a left-wing Chinese writer. And she was meeting Zhou Enlai and all these communists. It's all pretty steamy and interesting. But when she would meet with Victor and they would have lunch, you know, in his penthouse, he would rave against these Jewish refugees, saying they were the leavings of Europe and, you know, they weren't very smart. So there were always these kind of tensions between the sort of aristocratic Jews, even in a place like Baghdad, and the poorer Jews who were coming in.
One of our participants is challenging you on Japanese anti-Semitism. noted that Ted Koppel was apparently saved by the Japanese, and how, so sort of how widespread was anti-Semitism in Japan, and what was it compared to, say, European anti-Semitism?
It's a great question. So basically what's interesting is, China and Japan both are open to the West at the same time, right? The British invade China in 1840. About 10 or 15 years later, ships show up in Japan's harbor. Japan has been a closed society before that. One of the things that's different is that Japan responds by getting its act together. China essentially falls apart. It's invaded and basically carved up by the Western powers. The Japanese immediately begin to reform themselves. They send people all around the world to study Western methods. And they're very successful. And by 1905, they decide that they're strong enough to challenge Russia in a war. They're preparing for a war against Russia. To do that, they need to build up their navy. And so the Japanese finance minister goes to London to raise money to build this navy. And in London, he meets Jacob Schiff. Jacob Schiff is a Jewish financier from New York, immensely wealthy. The Schiff family is very well known. And like many Jews at the time, this is 1905, has no love for Russia, has no love for the Tsar. The Tsar is the reason, part of my family and maybe many of yours are in America, because they were fleeing the Tsar. And so Jacob Schiff basically says to the Japanese finance minister, I will help finance your navy, because if we have a common enemy now in the Tsar. And Schiff creates this syndicate that raises, I forget the exact number, but several $1 billion to help outfit the Japanese navy. So the Japanese defeat the Russians, and Jacob Schiff becomes lionized in Japan. He's given like the Order of the Emperor. When the finance minister of Japan sends his daughter to study in the US, she stays with Jacob Schiff. One of the consequences of defeating Russia is that Japanese military soldiers get copies of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is circulating all around Russia. And so the Japanese soldiers bring it back and they translate it. And that plants the seeds of anti-Semitism in the Japanese military, but with this variant as I describe it, right? So the Germans and the Japanese both believe that Jews control the world, they control the economy. The Germans believed you had to exterminate them, and the Japanese believed, can we work with them? Can we get them on our side? Because their lesson was, Jacob Schiff, this powerful Jew, helped us defeat the Russians. Maybe Victor Sassoon could do the same. So now today, I think what you've seen really in the past 30 years, there is more on the ground anti-Semitism in Japan. If you go to Japanese bookstores, you see a lot of that, and it's very upsetting. China is fascinating in that it is one of the, sadly, maybe one of the few countries these days that's actually philo-Semitic. The Chinese feel this great fascination with Jews, not just because they think we're smart about money and all that, but they admire the Jewish commitment to education, to family. They know about the Kaduris and the Sassoons. But also there is this connection that goes back to World War II, where when you talk to Jewish, and some of you may have had this experience from relatives and others, when you speak to Jews or read the memoirs of Jews who were in Shanghai during World War II, what they say over and over again was how nice ordinary Chinese were to them. Many of these Jews had fled Berlin and Vienna, where their neighbors were literally chasing them down the street or humiliating them or forcing them to scrub sidewalks. And they say over and over again, we got to Shanghai, we couldn't speak Chinese, we didn't understand anything people were saying to us, but people were nice. They would share their food with us. They would give our children rickshaw rides. And so I think at kind of a human level, whenever I go to China and you say you're Jewish, I mean, there is sort of a connection there, which is, I think very, very heartening.
I do think, though, also you should also, I think people should hear the story of what happened when the Germans proposed to right. the Japanese as to what they could do with the Jews in Shanghai.
Right. So what happens is after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese occupy Shanghai, and they now have direct responsibility for these 18,000 refugees. And the Nazis send over some of their kind of best practice officers in imposing the final solution. And these Nazis show up and they say to the Japanese, look, you've got these 18,000 Jews here. What you should do is on Rosh Hashanah, they'll all be going to synagogues. You gather them up as they're walking to services, put them on barges in front of the Cathay Hotel, sink the barges in the river, then you've solved your Jewish problem. And the Japanese are appalled by this. And they're appalled not only because of obviously the horrific nature of it, but because they're still clinging to this notion that the Jews are useful hostages. In fact, this anti-Semitic Japanese captain writes this incredible memo, which I've seen, where he basically is writing to his superiors in Tokyo. And he's saying the Jews are like fugu. Fugu is this blowfish that's a Japanese delicacy where it's delicious, but if you slice it the wrong way, the poison gets into it and can kill you. And so he said, the Jews are like that. If we treat them the right way, they can be useful, but you have to be careful. So they end up putting them in a ghetto. But again, the ghetto is in no way comparable to the Polish ghettos or any of the European ghettos. I mean, the housing is terrible, families are hungry. But one of the saddest things is that after the war is over, these Jewish refugees have been completely shut off from news from Europe. And when the Americans liberate Shanghai, they begin to put up posters listing all the villages that have been wiped out, all the survivors, but also those killed in Europe. And there are these haunting pictures of these Jewish refugees looking in the windows, trying to find anyone who survived in their neighborhood, in their city, in their family. And it's only then they realize that while they suffered during the war and didn't have enough to eat and lived in terrible housing conditions, the fate that would have met them in Europe was so much greater, so much worse.
A question about the languages that the Sassoons and Kaduris and spoke.
Yeah, well, they two aspects that are very interesting. Because they came from a family of traders, they spoke Arabic, they spoke Persian, they spoke Hindu. Arabic was sort of the language of government, and then Persian was the language of trade. Hindu became the language in India. But they also spoke something called Judeo-Arabic, which at one point I got a document about David Sassoon, who was alive in the 1820s, 1830s, and it was all written in Hebrew. And so I needed someone to help translate it for me. So I reached out to a professor I know of Jewish studies, and I said, can you translate this for me? And she wrote me back and she said, these are Hebrew letters, but it's not Hebrew, it's something else. And it turns out it was Judeo-Arabic, which is essentially, it was Arabic with Hebrew letters that only Jews in Baghdad spoke. And as a result, this was incredibly effective for the Sassoons because it was a kind of code that they could use. Shanghai was incredibly competitive, right? There are all these companies there, British companies, French companies, Americans, all vying for opium trade or other products. And the telegraph was being monitored. And when you read the documents, the Sassoons are always warning each other, be careful what you say and use code words. But Judeo-Arabic allowed them to communicate pretty freely because no one else could speak it. That became a problem for me because, as you can imagine, not many people these days speak Judeo-Arabic. And when I went to Israel, it turned out there were several thousand letters that David Sassoon had written to his sons. They're housed in Jerusalem. And luckily, there was a professor there who spoke and read Judeo-Arabic. And I spent several days in his apartment in Jerusalem as he was going through these letters and going, oh, this is an interesting one. And then he would sort of translate it for me. But as I say, they learned all these languages. It was a huge business advantage, but they never learned Chinese.
All right. This is wonderful. We're pretty much getting to our time. Any last words for us before we go?
Well, I guess what I loved about the book was the way it shows kind of Jews in action. I think, again, when we look about Jewish history, obviously there's a lot written about the Holocaust, and that's very important, and about journeys people have taken. But I do think that in this book, you're really seeing Jews who, you know, we could have known, right? They could be members of any of our congregations. And so there's a familiarity about them. And I think a certain pride that these families played such an important role in history. And as I say, kind of kept their Jewish values. So, and I think in a time of COVID, it is kind of nice to have a story that just completely takes you away from all the kind of craziness we're living in. And I think it's a great story to share. I mean, I think, you know, we lived in China for 3 years. And I think this was a way for my kids to, you know, not only experience China, but to realize through this kind of surprising history, they've got a stake in China too, not only as Americans, but also as Jews. And I think that was something I'm very proud of.
So I should let you know the comments in the chat that I've been following have been very, very positive, and people have enjoyed this a great deal. And I hope, as I said, that many of you will read the book as I have. It's really worth it. And I think that I want to just close by saying that one of the things that really struck me about this book was, you know, the Torah commands again and again. You have to take care of the stranger because you yourself were strangers in the land of Egypt. And the sense of the both of these families, the Keturis especially, I think, as refugees, and what that meant to them, and how that connected them with not just Jewish refugees, but with others who were, you know, not who didn't have it so well, is powerful. And you've sensed that that their being Jewish had a lot to do with many of the good things that they did.
And so when people ask you, why do Jews like Chinese food? Now you have the answer.
There we have the answer. All right. Can't end with better than that. Thank you so much, everyone. This has been wonderful. And, you know, I hope we'll have more and more things where multiple congregations can come together. And Jonathan, thank you. Really appreciate it. Give my best to Barbara and the kids.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining. Thank you.